In 2008, when the Republicans were looking for a candidate to be their presidential nominee to try to succeed President George W. Bush, the guy who was supposed to win in 2008, the guy who was the early Beltway favorite, was Fred Thompson. Fred Thompson, who was an actor on Law and Order, and who was a very large man and had a very deep voice, and who looks very presidential-ish from a distance on TV. And I've always thought that the Fred Thompson mania of the 2008 presidential race, the sort of pundit mania over the prospects for Fred Thompson, were largely based on what he looked like and the fact that he's a big guy and he has this big, great voice. I mean, in terms of his resume at that point, what he was most known for was being an actor on Law and Order. He had been a lobbyist for decades in Washington. And when you're a lobbyist for decades, that usually means you have represented some unpolitically correct clients, including, in Fred Thompson's case, some abortion rights clients, when he was then trying to run as an anti-abortion rights politician. In addition to being a lobbyist and being the guy on Law and Order, he had also served 1.5 terms in the U.S. Senate. But honestly, his time in the Senate was characterized by no real accomplishment of any note. There's no Fred Thompson legislative achievement that he was trying to run on. But still, you know, he's a big guy. He played the district attorney on Law and Order. He totally looks like he's in charge. Republicans loved the idea of him. This was some of the polling from before Fred Thompson got into the race, from the summer of 2007. Right? Plenty of other Republicans were already running at this time. The debates were already starting up. Republicans were already competing with each other for the nomination. Money was being raised and spent. Fred Thompson was not participating, but he was, for a time at least, at the top of the polls. As the other candidates actually competed, Mr. Thompson was easing his way into making his decision, figuring out finally late into the fall that, yeah, maybe he guessed he would jump in. But right off the bat, with all the Beltway press behind him, all this excitement built up, all those polling numbers excited about him getting in there, right off the bat, when he finally did decide to get in, things went very badly right away.
All eyes will be on former Senator Fred Thompson, who walks on the stage at the Republican debate tonight, his first debate since he joined the presidential race. And ABC News spent several months digging some revealing tapes out of the National Archives, shedding light on Thompson's role as a young lawyer investigating the Watergate scandal.
Fred Thompson has made much of his role 30 years ago as a young Senate lawyer, helping to lead the investigation of Watergate and President Richard Nixon. But a much different, less valiant picture of Thompson emerges from listening to the White House audio tapes made at the time as President Nixon plotted strategy with his aides in the Oval Office. Thompson's job on the Watergate committee was to lead the Republican side of the investigation. Nixon worried that Thompson's Democratic counterpart, Sam Dash, would outsmart Thompson. As the investigation picked up speed, Nixon grew increasingly concerned about Thompson standing up to the Democrats. Speaking here with his then Chief of Staff, Alexander Haig.
He's talking to Fred Thompson. I said, you're not
Weeks later, Thompson was still being described in the Oval Office as not very smart, but at least beginning to play ball.
Our approach is now, we've got a pretty good rapport with Fred Thompson. He came through Part1 this morning. He's very smart. Not extremely so, but he's friendly.
He's not smart, but he's friendly. See, that's a bad way to start a presidential campaign. The day of your first debate, I mean, maybe being insulted by Richard Nixon should be seen as a badge of honor in America. But being insulted by anyone, specifically for being dumb as hell, not a great way to head into your first debate on the presidential campaign trail. Once he did get in, Mr. Thompson's campaign also suffered from a lack of get up and go.
I appreciate very much your being here today and listening to me give my thoughts about this. And we'll, first of all, could I have a round of applause?
When you have to ask for the round of applause, even if you do it in kind of an endearing, I'm a large person with a deep voice kind of way, there is something wrong with you as a moving candidate. With everything from his stump speech speaking style to his getting in the race really late to his very light campaign schedule, Mr. Thompson fell very quickly from the guy who was going to win, right? The guy who was winning in the polls when the whole thing started, to the guy who was being openly derided as lazy once he actually got into the race. The New York Times reporting on a Thompson campaign stop in Iowa, where a Fred Thompson supporter who had admitted that Mr. Thompson had been outshone on the podium by the local state legislators who had introduced him. But in searching for an excuse for his low-key, low-energy performance, that Fred Thompson supporter said, quote, "I'm sure this is his fourth event of the day." The New York Times added parenthetically, quote, "It was, but one of those four was a walking tour of downtown Iowa Falls that took him to 2 stores and lasted less than 15 minutes. Fred Thompson is the guy who the Beltway said was totally going to win in 2008, purely on the strength of his folksiness, his presence, the way he talked. But in Iowa, he came in 3rd place. In New Hampshire, he got 1% of the vote. He was down in Duncan Hunter and Alan Keyes territory. Out of the first 5 contests, the only place he broke into the double digits was in South Carolina. But by the time he was coming in 5th place in Michigan, it was pretty clear that Fred Thompson was on his way out. And before Florida had even voted at the end of January, the Fred Thompson for president dream was over. Here's the thing, though, about Fred Thompson's failed presidential candidacy. The Beltway was totally wrong that Fred Thompson's folksy presence and his deep-voiced big guy actorliness would be enough to win him the presidential nomination. But the Beltway was right that Fred Thompson possesses those qualities. And during his short-lived, failed campaign for the presidency, the few times he actually turned those qualities on to work for him in a political setting, they worked very well. And the guy who was most often on the losing end of Fred Thompson's manifest, folksy, play-to-the-crowd charm offensive was a fellow candidate who also lost, who was named Mitt Romney.
A good number of the people who are uninsured can afford it and choose not to do so. A good number of people are eligible for government assistance.
Governor Romney's system has mandates in Massachusetts, although you've backed away from mandates on a national basis.
No, I like mandates. The mandates work.
Beg your pardon? I didn't know you were going to admit that.
No, absolutely.
You like mandates.
Let me tell you what kind of mandates I like, Fred, which is this.
The ones you come up with.
Here's my view. If somebody can afford insurance and decides not to buy it, and then they get sick, they ought to pay their own way, as opposed to expect government to pay their way. And that's an American principle. That's a principle of personal responsibility. So I said this: if you can afford to buy insurance, then buy it. You don't have to if you don't want to buy it, but then you got to put enough money aside that you can pay your own way. Because what we're not going to do is say, as we saw more and more people in this country doing,
you impose tax penalties in Massachusetts.
Yeah, we said, look,
buy it.
If people can afford to buy it, either buy the insurance or pay your own way. Don't be free riders and pass on the cost of your health care to everybody else.
The government is going to make you buy insurance.
Fred Thompson failed pretty miserably as a presidential candidate, but Fred Thompson was also 100% successful in pinning Mitt Romney down like he was a not quite dead butterfly on the issue that totally flummoxed his presidential campaign. Again, this year, just like it did in 2008 when he was running against the likes of Fred Thompson. As a candidate in the 2008 campaign, you heard Mitt Romney there saying that what he did for his state in Massachusetts was impose a mandate. He said, "I like mandates. Mandates work." And he described the way that he would enforce that mandate as a tax.
I like mandates. The mandates work.
Beg your pardon?
You impose tax penalties in Massachusetts.
Yeah, we say, look,
buy it.
If people can afford to buy it, either buy the insurance or pay your own way.
That is Mitt Romney taking credit for doing, as a governor, exactly what Barack Obama did as president, which Mitt Romney now says is the main reason you should vote against Barack Obama for a second term as president, because he did what I did. If you believe that argument, if you believe that the reason President Obama shouldn't get a second term is because he implemented health reform, then why on earth would you want to replace Barack Obama with a politician who did exactly the same thing? He just did it first. The Romney campaign is a totally incoherent mess over this right now. Since the health reform ruling from the Supreme Court, they have been flailing so ostentatiously on this issue that the right is freaking out about the prospects for the Romney campaign. The Wall Street Journal editorial page today on the campaign's confusion. Look at this. They say the Romney campaign has so bungled this whole issue politically that they have turned the Supreme Court ruling in favor of health reform into, quote, a second political defeat. After Romney said in 2008 that his health plan was a tax, and then in 2009 that his health reform plan was a tax, and then last week that his health reform plan was not a tax, and then on Monday his campaign said it was a tax, and then yesterday they said it was not a tax. After all of that, the Wall Street Journal today saying essentially enough. Calling out the Romney campaign today for looking, quote, confused in addition to being politically dumb. This is not some liberal commie editorial here. This is Romney's own side. This is an editorial page that is rooting for him to win. They say, quote, Mr. Romney promised Republicans he was the best man to make the case against President Obama, whom they desperately want to defeat. So far, Mr. Romney is letting them down. The even more pointed manifestation of this upset on the right with Mitt Romney is a whole bunch of people telling him to fire his senior staff. All sorts of Beltway reports indicating now that Mr. Romney will not fire anybody or accept their resignations, but he may add some new senior staff to take over and try to give him something to say about what he has put forth as his central argument against President Obama, which he still hasn't figured out what to say about. It's the worst possible thing for him to run on, and he has decided to run on it. And I don't think the problem is his staff. It is this particular candidate trying to run on the one thing he ever did as a public official that anyone ever associates with him. The piece of legislation so closely associated with him that he put it in his oil portrait that they hung in the Massachusetts State House to commemorate his governorship. He's trying to be that guy seated there on that credenza running against the thing that is sitting next to him on the credenza next to the picture of his wife. It is the inescapable, irreversible flaw in his candidacy. And that is something that even B-team Republicans or C-team Republicans or even Fred Thompson team Republicans knew all along. And were trying to tell us. And were trying to tell Republican primary voters when they were telling them not to pick Mitt Romney. Whether or not the rest of us could ever actually hear him say it.
The idea that the Republicans are going to try to beat Obamacare with somebody who authored Romneycare strikes me as, in the end, a dead loser. How are you going to distinguish in a debate between those two?
All he says was, I'll repeal Obamacare, and in the same breath, he defends Obamacare at the state level. It just doesn't wash, and it won't wash in the general election.
When you take a look at what Mitt did from the standpoint of Romneycare in Massachusetts, you're going to have a hard time finding a difference between Obamacare and Romneycare. I mean, that's just the facts, and there's no way around it.
Now think about what that means going up against Barack Obama, who you're going to claim, well, top-down government-run medicine at the federal level doesn't work.